In this video, I want to explain how Angular does data binding. And to explain it, I set up this simple example. So in this example, we've got an input field for first name, one for last name, and a paragraph for the full name. And the only code that we had to write is over here, where we've got some basic markup, and this input field is bound to the first property of the model, this one is bound to the last property, and this little snippet is bound to the full property. And in our JavaScript, we initialized this first property to be Adam, the last property to be Zerner, and the full property to be the full name, so the first name plus the last name. And so the question becomes, how does Angular do this? Well, I remember when I first started learning Angular, I thought that there was some sort of weird magic stuff going on, but it turns out that Angular isn't magic, and it has to do the same things that we would have had to do if we were setting up data binding ourselves. So Angular has to listen for events, listen for changes to these input fields. So that's the first thing Angular does. The second thing is, after you type in an input field and it listens for the event, it has to update the model, just like we would have had to do. So if we typed in like O here, it would listen for that event, and on that event it would update the first property, and it would update this first property. And then after doing that, it would have to update the DOM based on these updated model properties. So this would be updated, and this would be updated. That's the third thing. And finally, this isn't something Angular does or the developer would do, but after the DOM gets updated, the browser knows to repaint the UI. So this, repainting happens. So now that you know that Angular does all of these things, the next question becomes, well, how does Angular do these things? And the real answer to that question is actually pretty involved, and we'll get there. But before giving you the detailed answer, I want to go over a sort of a high-level answer. So let's go over that high-level answer. First, I want to get rid of... Whoops, never mind. Okay, so the deal is that Angular is going to watch DOM elements that depends on the model. So I'm going to explain this later, but Angular has this array of watches, and it's going to watch DOM elements that depend on the model. So this DOM element depends on the model. It depends on the first property of the model. This DOM element depends on the last property of the model. And this one depends on the full property of the model. So the deal is that when the user does something that could have changed the model, Angular is going to look through each of these things. It's going to ask, has this changed? If so, update the DOM. Has this changed? If so, update the DOM. Has this changed? If so, update the DOM. And so you might be thinking, well, that seems a little excessive, because if you type in here, the only model properties that could have changed are this first one and this full one. Like, typing here couldn't possibly have changed this last property, because last doesn't depend on first. Like, it's possible, it could be the case that last was, Zerner plus scope.first, in which case typing here would change last. But that's not the case. So you might be thinking, well, why do we need to look through every property? Why don't we just look at properties that could have possibly changed? And the answer to that question is sort of, well, it's sort of because Angular is inefficient. And Angular, well, more that Angular decides to make a trade-off. And let me explain. So other data binding frameworks they know that this can only have changed this and this. But for some reasons I'll get to later, Angular chooses not to do that. So Angular doesn't know whether or not you have this here. And because Angular doesn't know that, it's possible that you did have this here. So to be sure, Angular has to go through everything and make sure that it's in sync. So when you type in no here, Angular looks here, says, have you changed? Yes, you've changed. I have to update you. It's going to look here, see, have you changed? And we didn't have this. So the answer is going to be no. And it's going to look here and say, have you changed? If so, update the model. And in fact, this has been changed. So it's going to update the DOM, and that's going to, it's going to repaint the UI so that there's an O here. Okay, so now for a more in-depth explanation of how Angular does what it does. So I'm going to start off by explaining how Angular does 1 and 2. How Angular listens for user events and how it updates the model. How it does this is actually surprisingly very straightforward. Basically, Angular, when it sees ng-app, it knows, okay, I'm supposed to do stuff. If you didn't have ng-app, Angular wouldn't do anything. So it sees ng-app, and it goes through the DOM tree. And when it sees something like ng-model or ng-click, it sets up an event listener. So ng-model, when it sees ng-model, it sets up an event listener on an input field. So it sets up some sort of like key down event listener. And alternatively, if it sees like an ng-click on something like a button, it sets up a listener for a click event. So that's one. That's how it does 1. And as far as 2, basically, in that event listener, it says when this event happens, look at the value of this field and update the this first property of the model with the value of this field. So that's what it does for ng-model, how it updates the DOM. And as far as like ng-click, basically what that does is it says on click, run the corresponding function, so say hi. So if we had like a say hi function, scope dot say hi is a function, and if it just like alerted hi, it wouldn't update the model, but maybe it, this function sets scope.last to be hi, I don't know. And in that case, that's how it would be updating the model, by calling this function. So yeah, 1 and 2 are pretty straightforward. Again, it just sets up the listener and it updates the model. For ng-model, it looks at the value of the field and updates the corresponding model property. For ng-click, it just runs the function, and it's up to you to have the function do what you want it to do. Okay, so the next question is, how does Angular do 3? So after you type Angular listens to your event, it updates the model. How does Angular then, with this updated model, re-render the view? So update the DOM and then repaint the UI. How does Angular do this? Well, this takes a little bit of a background to understand, and the short answer is what I explained before about this watches thing, but let me give you the background. So, okay, let's give us some space. The first thing to understand is what a scope is. So scopes are literally just JavaScript objects. So scope, is literally a POJO, a plain old JavaScript object. Okay, so the other thing to understand is that scopes prototypically inherit from each other. So you've basically got this like tree structure of different scopes inheriting from each other. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that scopes all begin with this root scope is what it's called. And yeah, the other ones are just plain old scope objects, but it starts off with this root scope. This is also a scope object, all of these nodes here. And this is a root scope. Okay, so if you recall from before, we put our model properties on scopes. So each of these scopes is basically a different model. Okay, so another thing to understand is, oh, okay, so just to elaborate on that, each scope is its own model, so each scope has its own double $ watchers array. Okay, so now let's talk about the digest cycle. So you can initiate the digest cycle by saying scope dot $digest, like this. And what that's going to do is it's going to do what I explained before, where it's going to look at the double $ watchers for this scope. It's going to run through it, see, have you changed? If so, update the DOM. Have you changed? If so, update the DOM, etc., etc. So that's what a digest cycle does. It goes through the watchers and it updates the DOM accordingly. Okay, so another thing to know is that when you call digest on a scope, what it does is it recursively goes through the child scopes and does the same thing. So if you call digest on this scope right here, it's going to run a digest on this scope, and then it's going to go run a digest on this scope and a digest on this scope. So yeah, so if we call a digest on this root scope, we can know for sure that every scope is going to get a digest called on it because it's at the top, it's the root. And that's what scope.apply is. So if you've seen scope.apply, scope.apply is the same thing as saying root scope dot digest. And that's all there is to that. That's just a way of making sure that every scope in your app gets, a digest done on it, and it makes sure that everything in your view is up to date. Oh, and let me answer the question of when scopes are created. So this might have been a little confusing. I just drew this tree, but let me explain when they're created. So if you look at this diagram here, this basically explains it. Let's zoom in here. So when you say ng-app, that creates the root scope. Let's look at them side by side. So do that and this. Okay, so ng-app creates this root scope here. And when you do something like ng-controller, that would create a new scope that's a child of root scope. And another ng-controller would create a different scope that's a child of root scope and a sibling, I think, of this other scope. These two are siblings, greet and list. And there's other directives like ng-repeat that create other child scopes. So this ng-repeat would create a scope that's a child of this, etc., etc. So scopes are created by certain directives. Let me finish by giving you a little question. Do you think that, the question is what puts things on the watch list? So if I just wrote something like this, scope dot, I don't know, foo equals bar, would that add foo to this double $ watchers over here? The answer is no, because this watch list is to update the view with model properties. Okay, so if I said scope.foo equals bar, that's adding a property to the model, but this property isn't a part of the view. And watches and the digest cycle is intended to update the view with the model. And, foo isn't a part of the view. So things get added to this watch list in the digest cycle based on whether or not they're in the view. And that's all I've got for you. Hopefully this made the data binding in AngularJS a little bit more clear.